vyafanya uchaguzi wakati haviko katika gazeti rasmi ambalo limegusia na kutaja vituo ambavyo vitatumika katika masuala ya uchaguzi. Mheshimiwa Spika, swala la pili ni swala la wale wanaosimamia uchaguzi. Na Mheshimiwa Spika, kuna mabarobaro wawili hapa ambao wanacheka kwa sauti. Ningeomba wacheka kwa sauti za chini kwa sababu mzee anazungumza, kwa hivyo ni muhimu. Kwa Mheshimiwa Spika, nasema kwa
Senators, please consult in low tones, Let's not disrupt.
Tunasema Mheshimiwa Spika kwamba wale wanaosimamia uchaguzi pia sasa lazima sheria iwaangazie kwamba makosa wanayofanya, ukiukaji wa sheria unaofanyika katika wakati wa uchaguzi, Mheshimiwa Spika, ni muhimu wale wanaohusika pia wapelekwe mahakamani na waweze kuhukumiwa kwa makosa kama hayo. Mheshimiwa Spika, haiwezekani kwamba msimamizi wa uchaguzi akatae kuhesabu kura halali ambayo imepigwa na mwananchi wa Kenya. Mheshimiwa Spika, haifai ama haiwezekani msimamizi wa uchaguzi atangaze mtu aliyeshindwa kuwa mshindi na asichukuliwe hatua yoyote na sheria. Kwa hiyo Mheshimiwa Spika, sheria hii itasaidia pia kuweza kuchukulia hatua ama kuwapeleka kwenye sheria wale ambao watapeleka matokeo ambao si sawa katika uchaguzi ambao utakuwa umefanyika katika nchi yetu ya Kenya. Mheshimiwa Spika, kwa hayo masuala mawili mimi naunga mkono marekebisho haya ya sheria ya uchaguzi ya makosa ya uchaguzi. Asante Mr. Speaker.
Senator Eddy. Order Senator Methu.
Senator Methu, wacha. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think that
Senator Nyutu and Senator Methu, please. You are not in a marketplace.
Madam Speaker, I think Senator Methu seems to be very, very unsettled today.
Senator Eddy, please make your contribution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is a very important progress, Madam Speaker, from the NADCO conversations and a beacon of hope in the country, because every year that we have gone into an election, we have come out more bruised as a nation than before we went to an election. And therefore, it is in order to congratulate the members of the NADCO committee, starting with the co-chairs that, midwifed the production of the documents that then led to inform the pieces of legislation that we're going to see in this House, especially with regards to elections, electoral processes, electoral bodies. And this is one of those, Madam Speaker. And I like to start right away by supporting this particular motion, Madam Speaker, because one of the issues that we face as a country is that the commissions that run election are actually above the law, in the sense that the offenses that commissioners do make sometimes are reduced to mere mistakes. However costly they are, Madam Speaker, to the country, they end up not getting held accountable in the eyes of the nation. Madam Speaker, in 2007, I was a very young man in French School Kamusinga, and as a Form 2 then, the chaos that we experienced in our election and the resultant death that we experienced. If you remember, Madam Speaker, there was this envelope that eventually went to in the International Criminal Court. And in that envelope, when eventually the names were revealed in that envelopes, Madam Speaker, there were people from the police who were held accountable. And there were politicians who were held accountable. And there were public servants who were held accountable. But there was nobody from the commission then that was the referee that ran the election that were held accountable. Madam Speaker, fast forward 2013, when we had an election that was also contested. Even at appearing at the court, you find that the commissioners always escape scot-free from these problems. And therefore, it's very important that we support this bill. And the bill has attempted to look at those offenses by members and staffers of the commission. And I like the way they are very specific, to the extent that if you look, for instance, the issue of documentation of elections, that is under section 6A, subsection A. And it says that one of those offenses is if anybody makes in any record, return, or other document which they are required to keep or make under such written law an entry which they know or have reasonable cause to believe to be false or do not believe to be true. The documentation of an election, given the fact that this is one of the most radically looked at documentation. For instance, Madam Speaker, we know that forms of election, starting from Form A to Form B to Form C, that then is used to declare elections at a provincial level, and the other ones used at constituency levels, Madam Speaker. These are highly regarded forms that have got security features that are very clear. And Madam Speaker, we have seen a number of instances that those documents are doctored. And electoral officials have got so much power that that doctoring sometimes escapes the mind of the nation because of the bulkness that our elections are. You can imagine, Madam Speaker, that at a presidential level, we are dealing with over 46,000 polling stations. And those polling stations, Madam Speaker, sometimes if these things are not well documented, then we have a problem. And Madam Speaker, I don't want to belabor all the sections and all the offenses that have been listed here, but I wanted to make 3 quick comments. That, Madam Speaker, I think that I will be submitting a number of amendments on this bill, because it is one thing to look at offenses committed during the running of an election. But I think that the biggest offenses that we can face as a country are offenses through the entire process of an election. If you remember 2017 election that was cancelled by or nullified by the court, it was nullified based on the process of the election. And Madam Speaker, in my humble view, this bill seeks to sort 3 things, but it also leaves 3 things that I want to talk about. Number 1, this bill seeks to solve unreasonable delays and unreasonable doctoring of election results. I think that is well captured in this Section 6 amendment. From, if you read all the way from A to M, it is well captured. Number 2, it also seeks to sort the alteration of results. If I were to summarize what I'm seeing from this bill, which is why I'm supporting it. And number 3, it can essentially help us to correct ungazetted polling stations, which sometimes have also featured in a number of our election results, that you end up having some ghost polling stations, like what happened in Migori County, Madam Speaker, in the 2017 election. If you follow that nullification, Madam Speaker, there were variably so a number of polling stations that came to the Supreme Court as ungazetted, non-existent polling stations. that then were used to vary that election. To the extent that this bill can solve those three issues, it's a big step to the country. However, Madam Speaker, I think that this bill must also explore the entirety of an election process, which I don't think starts by the day of voting. I think that election starts becoming a fraud when we start by registering of voters. And this registration of voters, Madam Speaker, we have seen a number of disenfranchisement of voters. Even now, there are young people in this country, Madam Speaker, who would wish to be registered voters. But because the registration process and the issuance of IDs have been put as separate, Madam Speaker, I think we as a country should choose to believe that it is an offense if you're turning 18 years old and you are going to get your ID and you don't get it with your voter's card. It actually should be an offense. In fact, the issue of voter's card is something that this bill should help us question. If you have got an ID card that is genuine, why do you need a voter's card and you're already 18? And our laws say that at 18 you get an ID card, and at 18 you are a viable voter. Why then must this issue of voter's card be prohibitive for young people to be able to vote? We must be able to explore an amendment that I'll bring into this House on making sure that young people in this country can be able to get their ID cards and either their voter's card on time or use their ID as their voter's card. So that's one thing I'll be exploring, Madam Speaker. Number two, that I think is important in the registration process, Madam Speaker, is being able to clean our registers on time. I think that commissions at any given time, we must have a duration under which the commissioners must be able to clean the register. And if it is not cleaned the way we have seen a number of elections where a register of an election is not hygiene to conduct an election, so that you don't know which voters are in the register vis-a-vis which voters are actually viable to be able to vote, to the extent that the alteration of results in this country happen because of the issue of voter register, that the commission is being paid to take care of, and if this is something that should happen on a rolling basis. It should not happen that just by the time that we are going to the election is when you see this thing called mass voter registration, where commissioner wants to run around, and sometimes that audit of the voter register is not done properly. So this issue of registration, there are a number of offenses that the commission has done in this country that I'll be pushing amendments. I don't want to go into them in details, but I'll be pushing amendments on the registration of voters that I don't think that has been captured well in the offense that I'm seeing here. The second offense, Madam Speaker, that I think is very important is the role of the commission vis-a-vis the role of the secretariat in terms of looking at procurement as a process. Madam Speaker, if we don't solve the issue of procurement violations on election materials in this country, even if you hold an officer who is sitting on the day of election on some offenses, the election would have been rigged long time ago if there is no hygiene in our procurement processes. And there are a number of those violations, Madam Speaker, that I believe that we must be able to explore, and I'll be pushing those specific amendments on what constitutes offenses of procurement in nature. Because procurement of electoral materials, Madam Speaker, some of them start way before even the year of election starts. There are a number of indices that that have been seen that by the time an election comes in place, Madam Speaker, if you are to reflect on the election that we had in 2017 that was nullified by the Supreme Court, and then you juxtapose that election with the election that will happen in this country in 2022, Madam Speaker, you will find that the filth of those electoral processes happened at procurement, including the laws that our commission ends up signing with vendors abroad is extremely critical to be able to hold them accountable as an offense. For instance, Madam Speaker, if you take a vendor that you have procured from an electoral system, an electronic system that is supposed to deliver an election, and then you are a commissioner, plus the secretariat, who are the staffers of the commission, and then in that agreement, that contract, you do not protect the country's data, such that the institutions that are like what we saw in mathematics, where the institution now has got more rights on the data in the system than Kenyans. Madam Speaker, I think that signing such agreements is tantamount to an offense, because that opens the country to serious procurement problems that then, if not addressed, compromises elections, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, so I will be pushing some serious amendments on procurement processes. And then the last one, Madam Speaker, that I want to talk about today, because of pressure of time, is the issue of audit of elections. Madam Speaker, it's very critical that even as we look at the active element of offenses during the time that election is being carried out, if you look at the act we are trying to amend here, the Election Act offenses of 2016, Madam Speaker, it has seriously negated holding the commission to account on the basis of being able to audit an election. And at what point should that election be audited? I think offenses should be put on every single audit trail, so that you'll be able to show the country what the audit of an election should look like at the time of the election, just before results are given out without proper audit, after the results have been announced for all candidates at the local level and national level, and more importantly, after the gazettement of those results. Because if the audit query is not examined as offense, Madam Speaker, then it becomes very difficult to hold individuals who are running our electoral processes to account. So, Madam Speaker, this is a bill that is very good. It's a good start that will help us to look at unreasonable delays in elections. It will be able to help us look at altercation of results. It will be able to help us look at unexecuted polling stations as means of fraud. But I think there are larger questions in our electoral processes, Madam Speaker, that as I support this bill, I will be pushing forward for the amendment of this proposal, and we see whether we can be able to make sure that our elections can have proper measure of integrity through such kind of pieces of legislation. Therefore, I support, Madam Speaker, and I will be able to support further with amendments. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Senator Okenyuri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for granting me this opportunity. I wish to support this amendment that came as a product of the NADCO talks that were actually happening. I was privileged to be in the first bipartisan joint committee that was actually trying to solve issues that we were facing as a country. And I'm happy to see the product that came from the second team that went and looked at some of these issues and came with this legislative proposal. Madam Speaker, when you actually look at this amendment that has been sponsored by the minority leader and the majority leader, we have actually made huge progress, because when you actually look at elections in Kenya, elections in Africa, we've come a very long way. Look at elections in Africa, and for our case, Kenya. Most of the experiences we've had consistent agitation and refusal to accept election results. Once the opposition or any other party that has lost refuses to accept election results, you definitely know we are going to plunge into endless either war or court processes. And in court, Madam Speaker, we end up wasting a lot of resources, which we would have rather combined forces with the person who has won elections to work for the country, or work at whatever level you've actually been elected to serve people, Madam Speaker. So when I actually look at some of the proposals that have been made in this amendment, I think we are making good progress, especially when we are now coming down to the staff and members of the commission, because this is where it matters most. Sometimes I say elections are actually won on the material day of voting, where you have to get your supporters cast a vote in your favor. And we have people who take advantage of those processes, Madam Speaker. At one point, I remember I was approaching a polling station, and some of the electoral staff were reaching out to me and telling me, Esther, this is how people in this polling station are voting. Little did they know that at the back of my mind, I had whoever I was voting for. So I tended to imagine then, if that can happen to someone who is informed like me, what about other people who might not have that similar benefit? What would actually be happening would be very absurd, because then we would have electoral officials influencing people or taking advantage of people they know cannot make certain decisions at that point. So these offenses that have been noted by this proposal and the punishments that are being meted on those who engage in such offenses will go a long way in stopping such crafty officials and members of staff of the commission trying to tamper with the general result of elections. Madam Speaker, also, in this country, not just Africa, elections are seen as a do or die matter. It's actually in Kenya where politics is a means to attainment of wealth. That's why right now, if you look at what most people want to pursue is politics, because people think it's a shortcut to being rich and achieving whatever ends you may want to meet, Madam Speaker. So if we actually make laws which are very clear and strict, we are going to make some of these people who want to aspire for political leadership be motivated more to serve and not more on the end they are going to achieve, Madam Speaker. Because this is a reason why in other countries, when you actually study their cases, people fight to an extent where there is no election where the winner will be allowed to work on their own other than have power sharing agreements. Madam Speaker, we've had power sharing agreements and you've seen the effects. Sometimes if I would give my views as a private citizen, I say those are some of the worst leadership experiments we would want to engage in. So in respect for the rule of law, such proposals would be very good proposals to come, and we as Kenyans need to have a culture of respecting the rule of law. That needs to begin with us in political leadership, so that if you go to polls today and you lose an election, be very open-minded in accepting so that we can move forward. Additionally, if you're challenging the whole result, Madam Speaker, let it be within the law, whereby if it's the Form 34As at the polling station we are looking at, it be that you really had agents who had those forms duly signed, so that when you're disputing that in court, you're not doctoring documents and coming to dispute using that, Madam Speaker. Why I'm saying that, we have most candidates who lose the election, and when they file petitions going to court, the evidence is not sufficient. And eventually you see what we get into, Madam Speaker. Finally, politics should be one way that we can transform the lives of people. Leave alone what is the interest of an individual, but the larger interest should be towards bettering the lives of the people we have had an opportunity to represent. And so I will fully support this amendment, and I know we'll keep learning as we advance, because in every election we experience new challenges, and it's as a result of those challenges that we think about new remedies to address such challenges. So the law is not very fixed. We'll keep getting amendments to suit citizens as it well applies to them, Madam Speaker. So thank you. I support this proposal.
Senator Kajwang.
Madam Speaker, I also rise to support the Election Offences Amendment bill that is before the House. And Madam Speaker, it's important to reflect that this is one of the outcomes of the National Dialogue Committee, which was established at some point in the history of this country to stabilize the political situation. And Madam Speaker, I'd like to hail those who participated as rapporteurs, as chairs, as members of the National Dialogue Committee, and even those who presented memoranda to that very important committee. We are now starting to see the outcome of the work they did in the form of various amendment laws, but we are also seeing that result in the pacification of politics. And Madam Speaker, I hope that we shall find an equilibrium where our politics is no longer highly charged, our politics is no longer tribal, our politics is no longer partisan. We'll find an equilibrium where politicians will be speaking for the good of the country. Madam Speaker, the amendments to the Election Offences Act are straightforward, and they are subject of a negotiated and a long-drawn process. However, Madam Speaker, it is my view that the various pieces of legislation relating to elections in this country need a complete overhaul. In fact, Madam Speaker, I believe that we need to perhaps redefine our electoral system so that it reflects the unique characteristics of our nation. It reflects our history and reflects emerging and contemporary trends. Madam Speaker, let me give a few examples of where we need to change our election laws. I have said it before, that rigging of elections begins at the point of registration of voters. And Madam Speaker, it is not rocket science. And I wonder why we, the political class, cannot just accept that once you have a national identity card, that then should be the instrument that you use on the voter's day. Because the qualification to get an identity card is the same qualification to get a voter's card. And I have always wondered, and in my 10 years in this House, in my 10 years in elective politics, I have always wondered why that matter does not feature very strongly in our conversations around empowering the young people and around transforming our electoral system. Madam Speaker, right now you will find there are certain areas which, until as at the last election, there has been no effort to recruit the newly acquired citizens to become voters. And then we are going to have a stampede, a few months to elections. We are going to have campaigns, very expensive campaigns, a few months to elections, to onboard the young people as voters. Madam Speaker, how I wish, as we try to come up with national consensus on various matters, we could come up with that consensus that the national identity card is sufficient for our young people and for our citizens to participate in the voting exercise. Secondly, Madam Speaker, it would be important for purposes of national security and sovereignty, to ring-fence our elections from foreign influence. When I looked at the process of tallying of election results at the Bomas of Kenya, I've always asked myself, what is the role and place of diplomats, ambassadors, and high commissioners at the tallying center? Madam Speaker, in the last election at Bomas, the American ambassador was very visible, was very, very visible. Her fingerprints were all over the place. The UK ambassador was all over the place. And when we asked why, we were told that the US and the UK governments were providing technical support to the electoral system and to the electoral process. If there is one exercise that we must completely ring-fence and keep away foreign influence, it is in our elections. Madam Speaker, I read somewhere today that if news can be fake, then history can also be fake. The history of Africa is replete with rigged elections engineered by the West. It is replete with assassinated leaders engineered by the West. It is replete with coup d'etats engineered by the West. Madam Speaker, I am a Pan-Africanist, and I believe that there are those forces out there, out of Africa, that believe that Africa should remain independent, and Africa should never be fully independent, and Africa should never self-determine its direction. Madam Speaker, we need a law that says that when it comes to the infrastructure, the systems, the processes, everything to do with our electoral system, we shall make it homegrown. And we have no shortage of skills, whether it is a technology. The other day, the CS Treasury was here telling us about e-citizen, developed by locals. It is handling billions of shillings on a daily basis or on a monthly basis. If we can trust our young people to build a system of that nature, why can't we trust them to build an electoral system so that we do not have to go to foreign countries to get that technology? Madam Speaker, even when it comes to capacity building, it should not go beyond our electoral officers making tours to those countries to see how they do it. But we should not have a situation where you've got a foreign-funded organization being the one offering technical and capacity building for our electoral officials and our electoral systems. I believe, Madam Speaker, even if it's just coming from ordinary revenue, even if it's coming from a specified fund, our electoral system should not be subject of multilateral or bilateral agreements. It should be homegrown, because if we do so, we rid our electoral system of foreign influence. And Madam Speaker, if you African history, the West always has an interest in electoral outcomes, because whoever becomes the president of a country, Madam Speaker, sometimes influences the kind of relationships that country has with the West. We have seen interference in electoral systems in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madam Speaker. Even in Kenya, Madam Speaker, I am convinced that there has been undue foreign influence in our electoral systems. And so that is part of what we need to look at in a complete and comprehensive overhaul of our election laws. Madam Speaker, the senators in this House have to spend a lot of money to get elected. Why? Because we've got an electoral system that has put the responsibility for trust and responsibility of ensuring accuracy of results on the candidate rather than the commission itself. Madam Speaker, you have heard previously when petitions have been taken to the Supreme Court on presidential election results, where the IEBC, that is mandated to ensure trust, accuracy, and integrity of results, referring to returns of agents of candidates. Madam Speaker, we should not be investing in agents in elections. If we have an independent electoral body that is of the highest integrity and credibility, and it is a very expensive undertaking. Madam Speaker, you can imagine, before election day, 3 days to elections, all of us here as senators, when you're organizing your own campaigns, you need to call your agents to a central place to train them. You call them to a central place to give them the oath of secrecy. You have to keep them in a central place so that they are not poached by your opponents. On election day, they have to be at the polling station. They have to be at the tallying center at night. They have to sit for 3-4 days waiting for the results to come out. Meanwhile, Madam Speaker, you're maintaining them, paying them allowances, giving them airtime, taking care of their food, taking care of their accommodation. Election day expenses of a senator in this House, Madam Speaker, is on average 10 million Kenya shillings. That is if you decide to deploy your agents. in a proper manner. Of course, there are some of us who sometimes you find you don't have strong opposition, and then you decide to just ride on existing systems. But where the situation is tight, Madam Speaker, a senator will be required to have 10 million shillings for the 3 days, pre and post-election. If you multiply that by the 47 counties, we are looking at an enterprise, Madam Speaker, that is hundreds of millions of shillings. It's actually billions, Madam Speaker, that could have been put to better use. And I've just spoken about the position of the senator. I've not spoken about the woman representative. I've not spoken about the governor. I've not spoken about the president. Madam Speaker, in the American system, it is estimated that political campaigns, and that was about 8 years ago, was costing 16 billion US dollars. 16 billion US dollars on politics. And that was more than the budget of half the American states. If you look at our expenses when it comes to elections, Madam Speaker, it is money that could have been directed to other places, but we spend it because we have no trust, because we have an electoral body that has not demonstrated integrity. Madam Speaker, we need to also look at the other laws that relate to spending on elections, but we can reduce that expenditure if we build institutions, technologies, systems, processes, and an infrastructure that inspires trust. Madam Speaker, it should be enough for a candidate to present themselves on election day, make sure that people vote, and trust that the IBC officials and the security officials that are there will be able to provide a result that reflects the voice of the people. And yet, we never trust them. When you see policemen in that hall, you feel that they've been sent by the state to rig you out. When you see IBC officials, the default mode is that they are going to rig you out. The fear is that they are going to be bribed by your opponent so that they can declare the wrong results. And as a result, our polling stations have become battlegrounds where each candidate has got 2 agents, 5 security people, 5 mobilizers. It is against the election laws, but it is something that happens. And that is why sometimes it takes too long for results to come out of polling stations. Madam Speaker, interestingly also, when the tallying has been done at that polling station, candidates insist that they must be part of that entourage that transmits the results to the constituency tallying center. And then candidates insist they must be part of that entourage that transmits results to the county tallying center. Madam Speaker, that is a system that is broken, and we have time for us to change it. Madam Speaker, many of the countries that we look up to, what we are calling modern democracies, be it the US, they are holding their elections in November, I think 4th of November. They do not have the same system of fast past the post that they are imposing on us. Look at France, Madam Speaker. France election is a 2-round election for the legislature. You only win on first round if you get 50%. But otherwise, if you don't get 50%, even as a member of the legislature, you have to go for the second round. Look at South Africa, proportional representation. Look at the United Kingdom. We are talking of a Westminster style of democracy. Where did we get this mongrel of fast past the post, where elections have become ethnic census, where people sit down and say that we, the Basuba, we are many, or we, the Luo, or we, the Kikuyu, we are many, and so we are going to take the next election. And Madam Speaker, in the last conversation, there was something called Building Bridges Initiative. It was bastardized, it was shot down in the courts of law for lack of public participation, but there were some interesting proposals. I do recall a proposal that came from the governor of Kisumu, who is currently the ODM interim party leader. He had a proposal that we cannot take these Western systems in entirety. Let us try and build a homegrown solution where it is not a winner-takes-it-all approach, where it is not a fast past the post, where it is not our election is not an alliance of tribes. Madam Speaker, our election has been an alliance of tribes. It has been described in many words. There have been shareholding structures. There have been all sorts of conversations and nomenclature to our politics. It is wrong because it pits communities against each other. It pits tribes against each other. And our politics then becomes a game of chess where the antagonists are one tribe versus the other. We must rethink our electoral system. But this is going to take a very radical rethink, Madam Speaker, because when it suits those in power, then they are in no rush to change it. It is only when it does not suit them that they want to change it. And this conversation has been there from independence, and this is a conversation that brought the dichotomy between KADU and KANU. It was never settled, Madam Speaker, because we opted for a broad-based government at independence, the way we have opted for a broad-based government today. And as a result, Madam Speaker, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, 2 years later, was kicked out. They say history repeats itself. And I don't know which one comes first, as farce or as tragedy. But history truly repeats itself. The things we saw in 1965 have come back to haunt us in the year 2024. The things we saw post-independence, because of flawed politics of ethnicity, have come back to haunt us today. Madam Speaker, as I conclude, I want to encourage the House, Parliament, has a responsibility to scrutinize the report of the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. That report should never be limited to mundane bureaucratic matters. I have gone to the IEBC website, Madam Speaker. Recently, in my usual visits to my county, I like going to a polling station and telling my people that in this polling station you gave me 90% of the vote, and I want to thank you for that. In the past, the IEBC had a portal where you could go and click and zoom and go all the way granular to a polling station. And you could tell the presidential results there, the gubernatorial, the senatorial, the constituency results at that point in time. Madam Speaker, that stopped happening. And yet we are advancing more. So we are more capable of manipulating big data. 10 years ago, the IBC had that portal. Today, 10 years later, when artificial intelligence, big data, data warehouses have advanced, we do not have that visibility. Today, if you are to ask how many votes you got across your respective counties, unless you go and look at the form, that declaration form, we must push the IEBC to be transparent. We must push the IEBC to be accountable to the people of Kenya. The results of elections should not be held as a secret. We are not running a cult. We are running an open, free, and fair electoral system. And so, Madam Speaker, while I support this amendment to the Election Offences Act, I believe that a complete overhaul is necessary along the lines that Senator Khalwale had mentioned earlier. In the year 2016, when we were in this House in the 11th Parliament, there was a crisis prior to that election, and there was a bipartisan approach, a bipartisan committee. We called it the Windsor Committee, led by Senator James Orengo and Senator Kiraitu Murungi, that gave us the minimum reforms that were necessary then. I believe that we have enough time not to go for minimum reforms, but we have enough time to go for comprehensive reforms. Madam Speaker, I support and I do pray that the other NADCO bills will find their way to the House for quick enactment. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Senator Nyoto.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I also rise to make my contribution to this amendment bill, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we have a responsibility as members of this House to identify the problems that our people have and to make the necessary legislation, Madam Speaker. In this country, most of the problems that we have are related to elections, Madam Speaker. And every time we are going for elections, everybody gets scared of what is going to happen during and after the elections. This is because we do not believe in our systems, especially the electoral system. That is why I think it's very important that we come up with ideas that can help improve on this particular situation. And this bill could not have come at a better time, Madam Speaker. We know that in our history, the very many differences that we have had have come either just before the elections or after the elections. And why is this so, Madam Speaker? Because many people do not trust the system. And so, Madam Speaker, looking at this particular bill and noting that under the memorandum on objects and reasons as given by the majority leader and the minority leader, Madam Speaker, that we will create offenses for members and staff of the commission who unreasonably delay in declaring results or knowingly alter declared election results, Madam Speaker. I think the first step towards solving the very many problems that we have with our electoral system is making it a responsibility of the individual officer of IEBC. Because when we sue IEBC as an institution for offenses committed by members of the IEBC, staff of the IEBC, then it does not become incumbent upon a member when they're executing their duties to take the necessary or the due diligence and care. That is why when we make it through this bill, when we make it mandatory that whoever commits an electoral offense as in the execution of their duties as officers of staff or staff of IEBC will face the music, then we shall be beginning to get somewhere, Madam Speaker. This delay in declaring election results are what cost us the problems that we had in 2002. Because anybody that watched the events that were happening at KICC could tell that the delay, especially in the then Juja constituency and the Rakanithi constituency, the results from those two constituencies, the delay in announcing the results of those two constituencies, Madam Speaker, led to the build-up of the tension that was there in the country, leading to post-election violence of 2002, Madam Speaker. And that is why this bill needs to be supported by anyone who wishes Kenya well. Madam Speaker, looking at offenses by members and staff of the commission, especially A, that is 6A, where we will make a law so that nobody makes an entry that they have enough reason to believe that it is not true. This is something very important because when cheating in election happens, when this stealing of elections happen, it's by altering the figures, Madam Speaker. That somebody has 21 votes in a particular polling station, but then rogue IEBC official or officer adds a 0, making it 210. If that is done repeatedly in several other polling stations, then of course they alter the overall result of an election. And that is why this should be supported. Madam Speaker, we have assisted voters. And even here, when a senator is not able to or fails to cast their vote electronically, of course, we jokingly call them assisted voters. These are voters going to their polling station, sometimes who do not know how to read or write, or who can't read or write, Madam Speaker. And these are therefore then assisted by officers of IEBC. And this is another avenue where stealing of votes happen, so that you, the officer or the staff that is mandated with the responsibility of guiding such an assisted voter, then lead them in marking in the spaces that are not for the preferable or for the one that they came or they prefer to vote for, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we have a problem also in this country, and it is also it's not just about elections. It's about, people faking disability. And that is why I'm excited about number C, that whoever allows, when you have a reasonable, you don't have a reasonable, a reasonable cause to believe that somebody is visually impaired or has a disability, if you allow them to vote in a way that is only specified for such people living in such disability, then that you'll be held accountable for that. Because this is something that we should discourage as a society, that nobody prefers living in the disability. So when somebody pretends, in order for them to be able to gain some advantage or some favor, they pretend to be living with this disability, then such a person and anyone assisting them should actually face the law, because that is what progressive societies do, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there was one election where the Right Honorable Laila Molo Odinga went to Kibera to cast his vote. And then there was this particular presiding officer, and I can see that Senator Beth Siengo has actually raised her antenna. When the Right Honorable Laila Molo Odinga went to that particular polling station, I may not remember which election it was, there was a presiding officer who first told him that he did not appear in the register of voters. And this caused a lot of panic, caused a lot of tension, Madam Speaker. And it was not reasonable to do that, because such an officer ought to have known, ought to have, and I'm referring to number D, Madam Speaker, of 6, that if an officer willfully prevents any person from voting at a polling station at which they know or have reasonable cause to believe that such a person is entitled to vote, then of course the action should be taken to them, against them. Because such an officer should have known that the Right Honorable Laila Molo Odinga, of course, was registered in that particular polling station, regardless of what the register said. And I think we are also going to, through this law, to make officers also use reasonable judgment, because everybody has their brains, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, when we have people, when we have an election that is very close, 2 or 3 votes could mean a lot. And that is why numbers E and F under the same section 6 should be supported. That where somebody refuses to count any ballot paper, because even one vote can bring a difference, can make a difference, Madam Speaker, or they count a vote that they are not supposed to count, then action should be taken against them, Madam Speaker. And in conclusion, Madam Speaker, no officer should be allowed to omit anything in a breach of their official duty, because everybody should do their duty. That is why people are paid salaries. And Madam Speaker, unless people know that there is a consequence for any particular action, then they are not going to be serious about anything, Madam Speaker. And we must cure the problems that emanate from mismanaged elections, Madam Speaker. And so with those very few remarks, I support, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
The mover to reply? You're not pressed, you've not pressed, you're not there. There is no one on the dashboard. Okay, Senator Thangwe.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to also contribute on this Election Offences Amendment number 2 Bill 2024. And Madam Speaker, yes, I do support this bill because, of course, what the bill is suggesting, some of us have gone through it, and of course we would want it to be amended so that we can fill those gaps or seal the loopholes. Madam Speaker, as many have said, yes, the bill is supposed to cure the unreasonable delays when it comes to the announcement of election results, Madam Speaker. And I remember, although this is talking about the general election, I remember in 2017, Madam Speaker, there was a delay. I can give this as an example in Kiambu County, where the election of 2017, although it was the nomination, party nominations, where the results of the governor were announced, the results of the women rep were announced, but the results of the senator, they had to take about 3 days, Madam Speaker, to give the results. I think that was the period where the returning officers were cooking the results. So if this law was also to be applied within the political parties when they're doing their nominations, I think it can cure a lot of irregularities that would come with it, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the law is also talking about those returning officers who tally results of ungazetted polling stations. And also it has been discussed that no one, the returning officer or any other person, should interfere with the results, Madam Speaker. But Madam Speaker, looking at this law and what it's trying to cure, I think we are going to bring more amendments to it, Madam Speaker, because it has been said here that the election is a process. So we don't want to just look at the issue of counting the votes, tallying, and announcing the results. We need to look at the process itself from the campaign period, Madam Speaker. I have a bill, Madam Speaker, that is coming, and I think I will try to see whether it can fit as an amendment in this amendment bill that has been moved here, Madam Speaker. And my bill was called the Anti-Campaign Lies Law, Madam Speaker. What am I talking about, Madam Speaker? Madam Speaker, there has been a lot of lies against candidates when people are trying to campaign. And by lying, they lie to the voter who does not vote according to the way they understand their candidate, but according to how they were lied to, Madam Speaker. The same anti-campaign lies law, Madam Speaker, it also talks about lying on promises and policies and manifestos, Madam Speaker. And this is something that we need to look at as a parliament, that we should not allow people to stand and lie to the voter, and the voter will make a decision thinking that I'm voting for you to provide what you've just said, and yet, once you get in there, you change. So you made me vote for you as per what you had said, Madam Speaker. So I think this is an amendment that we need to bring into this law. And I can give an example again in 2017, Madam Speaker. Again is the campaign, the gubernatorial seat in Kiambu County in 2017, against the former governor, William Kabogo, and the former governor, Waitito Babayao, Madam Speaker. And it was said the governor then, in Kiambu County, had said nasty things about women. And by that, Madam Speaker, Governor Kabogo lost his seat. But nobody was able to prove whether he had actually said what it was purported to be said. And the person lost the seat. But since we do not have a law that talks about the anti-campaign lies law, he could not go anywhere. We call it propaganda and people think it's okay. Another example, Madam Speaker, we have the CS for mining. The CS, the former governor of Mombasa, Joho. He is on record, Madam Speaker, saying that he will never work with the President William Ruto. He called President Ruto a thief, and he said, I cannot work with him. Madam Speaker, many people never voted for William Ruto then because they believe in Joho. But today, Joho is in government. He is working under the same president, the same Ruto that he said he will never work with. So, Madam Speaker, they lied to the voters, and the voters did not make the right decision. The voters of Mombasa never voted for us, never voted for Ruto, never voted for President Ruto, Madam Speaker, because they believed in what was said by the then Governor Joho, Madam Speaker. So what I'm trying to say, and what
what's your point of order, Senator Idi?
Madam Speaker, I rise under Standing Order number 105. Madam Speaker, read together with Standing Order number 101 and with prevalence of Standing Order number 101 on content of speech. Madam Speaker, the content of speech of the Senator of Kiambu has provoked the word, "they lied to the people." And this is discussing the person of Honorable Joe, who is the CS for blue economy, mining in the country, Madam Speaker. There's a duality in that statement, Madam Speaker. There is one statement of fact issues that arises from the standing orders, but more importantly, Madam Speaker, is that it is discussing the persona of Honorable Joe to the extent that the Senator of Kiambu is mischaracterizing and prosecuting the persona of the CS in this House without a substantive motion, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I think that is very out of order, and I think he should be able to withdraw that statement, apologize to the CS Joe, vehemently so, and if possible, Madam Speaker, if he must speak the kind of language that he has put on the character of the CS, Madam Speaker, then
Senator Eddie,
it has to be the
can you
substantive
make
motion.
you've actually made your point on there, your point of order. Senator Karungo, do you want to substantiate at a later time, or do you want to withdraw?
Madam Speaker, now, this is what we are trying to cure. The truth, Madam Speaker. I have nothing to apologize about because it is in the public domain. And if you'd want me to substantiate,
Senator Karungo,
I'll bring that
please,
clip here.
Substantiate your statement by tomorrow, by Monday, when we.
Yes,
when the
and I
House
hope,
resumes.
Madam
You
Speaker,
can
when I
proceed.
substantiate, you will allow for us to play a clip or a video of the said CS.
Senator Karungo, please proceed.
I
with
will
your-
do that,
yeah,
Madam
but-
Speaker.
but
I will
submit
do
now.
that, Madam Speaker. And thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam
Senator
Speaker,
Eddie, what is your point
protects
of order?
me.
He has not even spoken. No, just speak where you are, please.
Madam Speaker, I stood under the point of order 101 and point of order 105. The Senator of Kiambu has responded to point of order 105, where he says he can be able to substantiate, Madam Speaker. But that substantiation, Madam Speaker, is an allegation that is tantamount to discussing the character of the CS, Madam Speaker. Understanding order 101, he cannot discuss the
Senator
CS
Eddie,
without a substantive motion.
That decision can only be made once he substantiates. Please.
Madam Speaker, I would say that Senator Eddie has a red tie.
Order, Senator Eddie. He has not continued to discuss the CS. That is your own saying, please.
Thank you very
Senator
much.
Karungo, you will substantiate
Yes,
on
Madam Speaker.
on Monday and proceed with your statement.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll do so. Madam Speaker, we can always substantiate the truth, and we will do that, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much. What I'm trying to say, Madam Speaker, is that this law is only talking about the voting, how to vote, where to vote, the tallying, the counting of votes, and then projecting the votes to the country to understand or to know the results, Madam Speaker. And that's what I'm saying. The issue is not about counting the votes. We are all here, Madam Speaker. We were voted for. It was counted. It was announced. It was said that so-and-so won. We even went to the courts, and it was ruled that so-and-so won, Madam Speaker. The issue is not about that. The issue is about the process of how we got there, Madam Speaker. And that is what we should cure. And I said, the issue of campaigns, Madam Speaker, there is a lot of misinformation and false statements in political campaigns. And that kind of misinformation misleads the voter about the candidate, about the policies, and of course about the election process, Madam Speaker. I remember, and I like giving these examples, and I hope Senator Eddie won't start when I give this example. During the Moi era, Madam Speaker, People were being lied to. They were told, if you don't want Moi, you put X where his name is. Madam Speaker, it was said all over. But you know, by putting X next to a person, that is a mark to vote for someone. And that's how people were winning election, by misleading people, by telling, if you want so and so, you put right, and if you don't want them, you put X. So again, you destroy the vote, Madam Speaker. So this is what we are talking about when it comes to misleading the people when they are making a decision. Madam Speaker, we need to protect the voters' rights. And that is the example that I gave that here today, Madam Speaker, by penalizing false statements that may influence voters' behavior, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I was voted for. I said I would stand with my people.